Question, why you were such an advocate for criminal justice reform in Tallahassee?
So the issue wasn't on my radar when I started 5 years ago, and I'll tell you how it came up for me. I was having a conversation with Representative Kathleen Peters in Tallahassee in August of 2015, and she was talking to me about her interest in the mental health issues as it relates to our state prison system, and really educating me. And so she said, why don't we go to a couple of places together? Because there's this unique law that allows any legislator to show up unannounced and walk in. So she and I agreed to do that. We did that in September of 15, did a women's prison in the morning. In the afternoon we did an adult male prison, but it also happens to be the place where they house youthful offenders, male youthful offenders. And we both left there not feeling really good about what we saw and heard. And so it was a couple of weeks after that I read an article in the Miami Herald about an alleged incident that had occurred in a youthful offender camp in the north of Florida. And as a former forensic auditor, I just didn't believe it could be possible that something like that would be happening in this state or this country. So I decided to take it on as a little audit project, and so I used all those skill sets that I have acquired over the years as a forensic auditor, and I thought about an audit plan on how I would accomplish finding the truth. And so I went to a couple of work release facilities so I could look at those facilities, but really went there for the purpose of trying to find inmates who had served time at that particular prison and getting their stories. And so before I ever went to that prison, I had talked to a number of people who had served time there, and through those stories had pieced together how this alleged incident could occur, and sadly confirmed that not only did this type of incident occur, but others like it. And so by the time I went there, I was briefed up, did my work, took all my results to the secretary, sat down with her and told her that really she had a facility that was not well suited for this particular population, and I gave her all my reasons. And she came back about 6 weeks later and said, you know what, you're right. And I'm going to close that prison as you've asked me to. And in doing that work, I got a lot of stories about the place where Kathleen Peters and I started. And learned that it was sadly a place where officers were beating these kids that were there. These are the kids that are direct file that are 14 to 17 years old. So then, having accomplished something with my first goal, I decided to continue the work. And I just kept coming upon things that were sadly troublesome to me, and so I decided to use my skill sets to try to make change. And so I continued that work, and I've continued to make change. Many of the things I've worked on have been reported. Some things have not, because I've got things under investigation and I don't want to interfere with that. But I've spent about 800 hours now in the last 2 years, and probably been on about 100 visits that average about 3 to 4 hours each. And I'm glad I've been able to make some change there.
So how much of that problem is because of through the private aspect of the prison system? Do you think it has a lot to do with that, or is it just, I know that a few of the prisons were private anyway. Did you see a distinct difference between the private prisons and the state prisons? Or, I mean, they're all state prisons, but you know what I mean, the ones that are managed by the government, the state?
So there are some differences. We have 50 prisons in the state of Florida. 7 of them are managed and operated by private prison operators. The others are run by the public sector, by state employees. There are differences in that those facilities were specifically built to be operated by private operators. They're newer facilities, they're in better shape. The 7 of those have air conditioning. They're the only prisons that have air conditioning in the state of Florida. So the other big differences you'll see is that for some reason, somebody along the line made a policy decision in the legislature to allocate a lot more educational dollars to those private facilities and to those private contractors. So they get a lot more money for educational purposes, and they're running educational programming and so
The
forth.
private facilities.
The
too.
private facilities, exactly. And that's an issue I've been looking at over the last year or so as I've been looking at different issues, is whether or not there's a proper allocation of resources in terms of who's getting money for education and who is not.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the thing, but
Yeah.
But that's interesting. So I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but so you're a progressive Democrat. You're probably usually not for privatization of state services, and I imagine the prison is the most, big privatization project there could be. But you're saying that because of the way it's allocated, the resources allocated, the private prisons actually run better. The way it's currently constructed. Is that what you're?
No, I'm not. I wouldn't say they're run better at all. And I will
or
say
the outcomes for the inmates are better.
No, well, I'm not going to say that either, because I think there's some real problems, and I'm continuing to do some work in that area. But I have to say that when I went into this, I really didn't have an opinion about private. I didn't have any experience, and so. I have spent time. I've been to all 7 of the private facilities, and I've been looking at those. I do question why we are spending so much more money on education and programming in those 7 facilities compared to other state-run facilities. I mean, why should an inmate's outcome be different depending on whether or not they're in one of these 7 facilities versus the other 43? I don't think that's fair. And there are all sorts of motivations, if you will, by inmates. For example, many of them want to get to one of the 7 facilities because they're air conditioned. It's more comfortable in the summertime. And also I've heard stories of the inmates at the private one being less troublesome, if you will. So the easier inmates, cherry picking. And while the private prisons don't pick what inmates go there, the contracts are structured in such a way that they don't take the highest security risk inmates. And so it would be more costly, if you will, for them to operate one of the facilities with high-risk inmates.
No, my question was that you're saying that the outcomes that you witnessed are better in the private ones. You're just curious as to why that is. You question the reason why that's
I'm going to push back on that, because I don't think the outcomes are. I haven't seen where the outcomes would be better. If you, for example, if you give the same educational dollars to a state-run facility that you're giving to the private, I haven't seen any better outcomes there.
Okay.
So. Yeah.
Anyway, well, that's interesting. Maybe if we do a story on that, we can re-interview you for that inspiration. But back to your campaign. My point is, you had so much influence on this. If you're a member of Congress, you're not going to be able to do that to the same degree. Maybe you can push back on that, but you won't. You're not going to have the same ability to walk into a state prison, will you? If you're a member of the House.
Well, I don't know. If we don't have a law right now allowing congressmen and women to walk into federal prisons, then maybe we need to add that law, and I'll certainly be looking at that.
So on the national level, then, let's say you win. What are some of the top priorities for you on criminal justice reform that you'd like to see implemented or changed?
So, well, first of all, I want all people to be treated with dignity and respect. And so, to the extent they're not being treated with dignity and respect, then that has to change. And if that means that we have to continue to shine a light on, what's not going well, then we'll do that. But the other thing we need to really take a serious look at is who we are putting in prison, because a large number of people are going to prison for nonviolent crimes and victimless crimes, and there may be other alternatives where we can always keep our citizens safe, but not have our prisons so jam-packed filled.
So you talking about like maybe decriminalizing marijuana then?
Decriminalizing marijuana, looking at any issues where there are crimes where there are no victims. I think we ought to look at alternatives, and obviously drugs is one thing that we need to look at. some of the guidelines and the provisions that have been put in place have proved to not be very good and not really to make our society any safer. If you look at what some of the countries in Scandinavia are doing, it's really quite remarkable. I mean, they're closing their prisons because they're actually rehabilitating people. You know, sadly, we're not doing a lot of rehabilitation in our prisons.
So, having been in Tallahassee now for 6 years, you will, if you win, that'll be the end of your Tallahassee career, so 6 years. What is the biggest thing that you could do as a member of Congress to make change in Tallahassee? What type of things could you do in terms of freeing up more resources or providing leadership? What could you do to make change here in the state concretely? Because a lot of people look at members of Congress and it's a different job. I mean, you have a more limited effect on what you can do here in your constituency, but you probably can now. So what are some things that you could change in that respect?
I think that obviously the budget's bigger than the state budget and so forth, but there are still many things that can be changed. As I mentioned earlier about constituent services, most people don't really focus on the fact that a large part of a state legislator's job and a congressperson is fulfilling daily responsibilities of taking care of constituent needs, and that's a big part of the job. You know, when someone's not getting their Social Security check and you've got to figure out what's the problem, and when someone's not returning their phone call to even talk about it, that's a big part of the job. But the other issues that I want to work on where I think that I can make a difference is related to healthcare. Healthcare is going to continue to be a big issue. I've been on the healthcare appropriations in the state of Florida for 5 years now. A lot of the money comes from the federal government, so those are the same issues that we'll be talking about in Congress in Washington, D.C. Immigration obviously is a big issue here in South Florida, and I'm very interested in that topic as well. And I think that there are ways to be effective. You know, it's funny because when I went to Tallahassee 5 years ago, people said, "Oh, you're just a Democrat. You can't make a difference in Tallahassee." But I have made a difference. I've made a difference in the work that I've done in prison reform. I've made a difference in securing funds for my community back here in the budget. And so I know that I can be just as effective in Washington, D.C. because I'll use all those same skill sets that I'm using in Tallahassee to reach across the aisle, to work with people, and to get things done.
So, President Trump will still be there, probably. Who knows? But probably by the time you get sworn into office. So what would you do to fight him? What would you do to fight his agenda and to a lot of your constituents would want to see that. So what would you do to fight the president on a lot of those issues? Well,
I think that he and I probably disagree on almost everything in terms of policy issues, large policy issues, and I'll continue to call that out. But in terms of some of his personal issues and conflicts of interest, I think my background as a forensic auditor and a CPA make me uniquely qualified to be able to speak to those issues, whether it's tax issues or whether or not it's the related party transactions that he and his family may have with government agencies directly or indirectly. I think I can ferret out the truth perhaps better than others because of my background as a forensic auditor. And I'm not going to be afraid to do that.
So if you got, right now there's already members of Congress who have called for him to resign because of his all the allegations of sexual impropriety. Would you call for him to resign?
I have called for him to resign. And if he doesn't resign, I think he should be impeached.
With the facts that we know now, you think he should be impeached?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, just the sexual harassment alone, right now we see members of Congress resigning, right? Why is he getting a free pass?
Now, it sounds like what you were saying about being a forensic auditor, you were kind of tiptoeing that in an impeachment process, you may be that may be good to have you there, is what you were kind of alluding to, I imagine.
Exactly.
How would that be helpful?
Well, it's just the same way in using the skill sets with getting to the truth in the prison system. You know, I spent 30 years as first a Pentagon auditor and then a consultant and doing a lot of forensic work on contracts. I've interviewed hundreds of people in my work, and I've gotten pretty good at reading people in terms of whether or not they're lying to me, whether or not they have something that that they don't want to talk about. And I've used those skill sets to uncover some of what's going on in the prison system by interviewing people. And I'm going to use those same skill sets in Washington, D.C. And I'm not going to be afraid to call this guy out.
Just a few more. We're almost done here. I appreciate it. I know you're probably jittering over there to get him something else. So this is interesting. So you are running very much saying the president should resign, and if he's not, I'm going to try to impeach. I'm going to try to help impeach him. So that's part of your campaign, a big part of it.
Yeah, and I've said that publicly.
Well, now there are a lot of other Democrats in this race, a whole slew of them. You could field a baseball team almost. Why are you the best Democrat to represent this district?
It's a great question, and it's a fair question. I think that I have very clearly demonstrated in Tallahassee that I know how to get stuff done even in a partisan environment. Think about the fact that in Tallahassee, 2/3 of the legislature is Republican, and I'm in a minority, but I've still been able to get things done because I know how to work with people. You know, in my consulting firm, I represented, first of all, as an auditor. You know, when you're going into audit, you're not really a welcome person, right, in the environment because you're looking for something. And then as a consultant, trying to help my client when maybe they have violated the terms of their contract, and I'm trying to get the best result for them and to try to get to the truth. I'm very used to being in a room where there are other people that want something very different from what I want. And so I'm not uncomfortable in that environment. You know, some people don't want to be in that situation where they're in conflict with somebody else. But that doesn't bother me. I've done that my whole career. And that's exactly what I've been doing in Tallahassee. I'm in a room with people that have very different positions from what I have. But I have found ways to meet them on the issues where we can agree upon, and in building relationships, move them closer to my positions where they're able to move.
But so you don't see, it doesn't undercut you in any way though, because you've worked with Republicans. The person who helped you shut down Lancaster Prison was a Republican. But you're going into Congress saying, I want to impeach this guy and he should resign. I mean, that's a pretty strident view. Won't that undercut your message of wanting to be bipartisan and working with people, having such a
No, I don't think so at all. I think I would join Democrats and Republicans to say anyone that sexually harasses somebody and it's proven should go, and I don't care if they're a Democrat or a Republican. So the fact that you can't have it both ways. You can't say that you're only going to call out somebody on the opposite party. So you have to decide what's right and be consistent in your views, and I think I have been.
All right, just a couple more quick questions here. On healthcare, you support, your position on healthcare is you support a universal healthcare system. It sounds like a European system. That's a system thing people say all the time. Tell me what your healthcare strategy is, what your plan for healthcare is.
On day one of my campaign, I have called for a single-payer system, Medicare for all. I do think that we will get there in this country. It's not going to be an overnight journey, but I think that should be our goal, and I support that position. I do believe that we'll probably move in steps to get there, but I think that's where we need to be.
And on gun control, do you support an assault weapons ban? How far do you want to go on gun control?
Yes, I mean, we have got to do a lot more work in this country on gun violence prevention, and that means assault weapons. That means these bump stocks. I filed a bill this year to ban bump stocks, which, before Las Vegas, we didn't even know what a bump stock was, right? So, but I filed a bill to make it illegal to purchase or to even possess a bump stock in the state of Florida.
But what, so soul weapons ban, yes. Bump stocks, yes. What other, I mean, do you support, I mean, some Democrats want to, get rid of the Second Amendment. Do you go that far?
No, I don't. I don't want to get rid of the Second Amendment. So, but I think we ought to have background checks, universal background checks for everybody. I don't. I think we need to close the loop on by being able to go to a gun show and buy a weapon there without having a proper background check. That needs to be closed.
All right, now, another issue that you're talking about is public schools. You support traditional public schools. I imagine that you're against charter schools then. You're going to be, if you're elected to Congress, Betsy DeVos is the Secretary of Education. She has a very different position there. The Trump administration has a very different position there. So what would your leadership be on education?
So I do support traditional public schools and I got a great education in a traditional public school when I was growing up. What I'm seeing right now is a systematic demantling, if you will, of the public school system and a shifting of resources towards privatization. And it's very similar to what I have seen in these private prison operators, where money is shifted in greater proportion to the privatization, to the profit-making institutions. But I do not believe that we should be making profits on the backs of school children. I just don't believe that. And I don't support charter schools in the way that they are structured right now in the state of Florida. And I'll be very vocal on that.
But I'm sure there's some parents in your district who probably send their kids to charter schools that like it, that think it's very successful. So what would you say to them,
I would say that I understand their position, I respect their position, and then I'm going to explain the funding, the numbers in terms of how money is being shifted from public to privatization. I mean, just the issue alone with constructing a school, you may not know this, and most people don't, but let's say that in a marriage, you decide you want to run a charter school. You can have your wife build the actual building, and then you can run a 501c3 charitable organization, a charter school, and you can rent the building from your wife. And there's not even a law in the state of Florida that says that the rent that you pay your wife for that building has to be at fair market value. You can pay her anything that the two of you have worked out, but that's a related party transaction. And by the way, when you go away and your school closes and the building is paid for at taxpayer expense, then you own that building privately. And that's a real problem that I have with charter schools. And that's, by the way, not all charter schools, but that is one abuse that I have seen in the charter school system.
So you'd want to reform it? You wouldn't necessarily want to get rid of all charter schools?
It would have to be such significant reform that we would not call them charter schools anymore. It would be called something else.
All right, interesting. This is my last question for you, and I appreciate it very much. If you were elected, you'd be the first ever gay congressman from Florida, which would be a big deal. I know that you don't try to define yourself that way, but that is part of your story. So what would that mean, do you think, do you think that would matter to people in this district? Do you think people would care? I mean, how would that make you different in Washington and perhaps give you a different platform?
It's certainly going to be remarkable, just as it was 5 years ago when I won in August of 2012 and became the first openly gay person to ever win a seat in the Florida legislature in the history of the state of Florida. So it'll have that same tone, if you will, of history. But in terms of the work that I do, I said when I went to Tallahassee 5 years ago that I was going to be a legislator who happens to be gay, and not just a gay legislator. And I work on lots of issues, but I am very interested in LGBT rights, and I have been a voice for our community in Tallahassee, and I've actually gotten things done for the community in Tallahassee, which perhaps would not have gotten done if I weren't there speaking up on it. I've got the first pro-LGBT bill ever passed out of a committee, ever. I got the first line item in the budget that was to support an LGBT initiative. So sitting at the table and being a full participant does make a difference. And I think in Washington it'll be the same way. I mean, and it's not just Florida, by the way. There is not an openly gay congressman anywhere in the South. So if you go, all the way from Texas all the way up to Washington, D.C., and until you get to Rhode Island, you're not going to find an openly gay congressman.
But you would feel a little, for what you just said, you would feel that you would also be looking after some of those folks in other places.
No,
you have a wider constituency than just the, just the district. In Florida.
Absolutely. It's the same way here in Florida. I got elected to represent District 113 here in Miami and Miami Beach. But the truth is that I have come to represent the entire LGBT community in the state of Florida. And I get calls from people all over the state asking me about issues or asking me to be an advocate on this issue. And I think the same thing will happen in Congress, that I'll be a national voice on LGBT rights.
And you feel like maybe some of those hard-won gains are in danger of slipping away if things are continuing the way they go in Washington?
Well, certainly we're concerned about some of these bathroom bills that are being filed.
What if the president's able to nominate another Supreme Court justice in the next year? I mean, you wouldn't have any say in that in the House, but are you concerned that slippage may continue if
Yeah, all of that stuff concerns me, but I will tell you that people have been enjoying the right to marry the person they love now for a few years, and I think even with a change in the Supreme Court, it's going to be very difficult to turn back that clock.
Well, good. Well, very good. Well, sir, I appreciate it very much.